The fluorescent lights in St. Mercy's Hospital flickered, buzzing like angry hornets. Elijah Moore paced the grimy hallway, calloused hands wringing together, sweat dripping down his temple. Every few seconds, he glanced toward the double doors of the maternity ward, hoping, praying. The clock on the wall seemed broken, its second hand jerking in erratic spasms. A nurse in a crisp white uniform finally emerged, clipboard in hand, but her face was flat, almost irritated. She didn't meet Elijah's eyes. He rushed forward, heart hammering against his ribs. "How is she? How's Christine? And the baby?" The nurse sighed, like she was tired of being asked such questions by people like him. "You got 2 babies, twin girls," she said sharply. "But your wife didn't make it. She bled out. Nothing we could do." The words slammed into Elijah's chest like a freight train. He staggered back, gripping the edge of a cracked bench for support. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The nurse shoved a clipboard at him, demanding signatures. "You need to make arrangements. We can't keep her here long." Elijah barely registered the pen scratching the paper. His world tilted, blurred by the sting of unshed tears. A heavy-set orderly wheeled 2 tiny bassinets toward him, wrapped in thin hospital blankets. "Take your girls," the nurse said without warmth. "Ain't no one else comin' for them." Elijah looked down at them. 2 miniature faces, identical but separate, breathing soft puffs of life. His hands shook as he picked them up, cradling one in each arm. They weighed almost nothing, yet in that moment, they felt heavier than the sky itself. He pressed his forehead against theirs. The hallway around him disappeared. "I got you," he whispered brokenly. "I swear. I got you both." In the corner of his ear, he caught the murmurs of 2 nurses gossiping near the desk. "Poor fool," one of them muttered. "How's a black carpenter gonna raise 2 babies by himself?" "Won't last 6 months," the other replied, smirking. "Bet them girls end up wards of the state." Their laughter was a knife across Elijah's back. He stood straighter, adjusting his daughters against his chest, feeling their fragile bodies twitch in sleep. He walked past them without a word, every step sealing his vow deeper into his bones. Outside, the night was cold and sharp. His breath misted in front of him as he trudged across the cracked parking lot, ignoring the glances from the security guards. One of them, a young man with a sheriff's star pinned to his chest, leaned against a squad car, smirking. "World stacked against you, boy," he said, spitting on the asphalt. "Might as well hand them over now and save yourself the trouble." Elijah didn't stop, didn't flinch. He tightened his arms around the sleeping bundles and kept walking into the night, into a future full of uncertainty and walls built to break him. Above him, the stars blinked cold and distant. Somewhere in the darkness, a mockingbird sang, lonely, stubborn, refusing to be silenced. So would he. Elijah Moore was a simple carpenter with nothing to his name but a set of rough hands, a broken heart, and now 2 lives depending on him. But he wasn't about to let a world soaked in hatred and cruelty take them too. He would carve a future for them with those same worn hands, splinter by splinter, no matter how long it took. And he would do it alone. The shack at the edge of Monroe County creaked under the weight of another storm. Rain clawed at the tin roof, leaking through patched holes, pooling in pans scattered across the wooden floor. Inside, Elijah Moore rocked a battered chair slowly, balancing 2 tiny bundles against his chest. The twins slept fitfully, unaware of the world that waited outside. A world that had no room for them, no mercy for their skin, no kindness for their bloodline. Elijah hadn't slept for days. He stitched cloth diapers from old bed sheets, boiled river water over a single burner stove, and prayed each night that the next morning would bring milk, or at least a kind neighbor's pity. Every morning, he made the same journey down the muddy road, twins tucked under a patched coat. The black churchwomen shook their heads, but filled bottles with borrowed milk, whispering prayers under their breath. "They ain't just yours now, Elijah," one of the elders said, pressing a warm bottle into his hand. "They're all ours. You fight. We fight." It was the only warmth he found in a town colder than the rain. Inside the shack, he built 2 cribs out of scrap wood salvaged from abandoned barns. Splinters dug into his fingers, but he sanded every board smooth, singing low hymns to muffle the twins' whimpers. The cribs wobbled, just like the walls around them, but they held. Neighbors peered over the sagging fence, their faces wrinkled with doubt. "Man like that ain't got no business raising babies," they whispered. "No woman, no steady money. He gonna break before the year's out." Elijah ignored them. He fixed a mobile over the cribs, crafting stars and moons from twine and tin foil, letting the pieces spin slowly when the wind seeped through the cracks. He carved the twins' names by hand into the wood. Lillian and Amara. His wife's voice echoed in his memory, choosing those names with a smile wide enough to light up any room. "Strong names for strong girls," she'd said. Nights were the worst. Loneliness wrapped around him tighter than any blanket. He would sit by the small stove, the twins sleeping beside him, and talk to Christine's photograph. "Am I enough?" he would whisper into the dark. "Can I be both father and mother? Will they hate me when they grow?" The photograph never answered, but sometimes, when the wind howled just right, it seemed like he could hear her laugh. Bold, defiant, alive. By the time the twins were 6 months old, Elijah had perfected a clumsy routine. He bathed them in a metal wash basin, warmed bottles under his armpit when the stove ran dry, and wrapped them tight against the winter chill. Their first smiles cracked something open inside him, a fracture of hope in the hardened shell he wore against the world. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, he caught Lillian gurgling at the mobile above her crib. Amara thrashed her fists, demanding attention. He laughed, a rusty sound unused for too long. "My girls," he said, voice thick. "Y'all gonna be something fierce. I swear it." Every penny he made, fixing broken chairs, mending fences, carving simple stools for the few kind souls who still remembered his shop, he tucked into a rusted coffee can buried beneath a loose floorboard. That money wasn't for food, wasn't for clothes. It was for schooling, for a future beyond cotton fields, janitor closets, and back alley doors slammed shut. Sometimes at night, when the babies stirred and whimpered, Elijah would sit them on his lap and show them the stars through the cracked window. "Those lights," he whispered, "they're maps. You just gotta find yours. And no matter what this town says, you got every right to fly higher than any of them." He rocked them until his arms ached, humming old freedom songs passed down from men who bent under chains but never broke. Outside, the world stayed hostile. Confederate flags fluttered on front porches. Shopkeepers watched him closer than the merchandise. Sheriff's deputies let their hands linger too long on their gun belts when he walked by. But inside that shack, surrounded by cracked wood and the scent of hope, Elijah built a fortress out of lullabies and stubborn love. The twins were growing stronger every day. and so was he. No matter what the world whispered through the cracks, no matter how cold the nights got, Elijah Moore wasn't going anywhere. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. The first time Elijah met Clara Simmons, it felt like grace in human form. She was soft-spoken, a widow with kind eyes, always baking pies for the church socials. She praised Elijah's handmade cribs, pinched the twins' cheeks gently, and said the words he hadn't heard in years. "You're doing a good job, Elijah. They're lucky to have you." He wanted to believe her. Lord knows he needed to. The wedding was small, a few neighbors from the black side of town gathering under the big oak tree, gospel music humming through the warm Alabama air. The twins, now 5 years old, twirled in second-hand dresses, giggling as they tossed wildflowers into the breeze. For a while, it felt like hope had finally come to stay. Clara braided the girls' hair before school, baked sweet bread on Sundays, and warmed the shack with laughter that almost sounded real. Almost. It started small. Little snaps of anger when the girls spilled their juice or tracked mud across the floor. Tight smiles that didn't reach her eyes when neighbors praised how bright Lillian and Amara were. Then came the day Elijah returned home early from a furniture delivery. The shack was eerily silent. No humming, no giggles, no tiny feet thudding against the worn floorboards. Then he heard it. A sharp crack, a muffled cry. He dropped the wood planks in his arms and bolted inside. There, in the dim light of the kitchen, stood Clara, brandishing a broken broomstick. Lillian huddled in the corner, arms wrapped protectively around Amara, both girls trembling. "You filthy little bastards!" Clara snarled, raising her hand again. "You ain't nothing but your no-good mother's shame." Before she could strike, Elijah stepped between them, grabbing the broom mid-swing. His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. "You touch them again," he said, low and steady, "and you'll answer to God before you answer to me." Clara's eyes flashed with something sour and hateful. "You think anyone decent wants a broken man raising bastards?" she hissed. "You ain't nothing, Elijah. Just another fool raising girls who'll marry off and forget you ever existed." She spat at his feet, grabbed her suitcase from the corner, and slammed the door so hard the walls shook. Elijah stood there for a long time, the twins clinging to his legs, silent tears soaking through his jeans. That night, he knelt beside their bed, stroking their curls as they slept. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the dark. "I should have seen. I should have protected you better." He renewed the vow that had carried him this far, but this time it was forged in iron. Never again would he gamble with their safety. Never again would he let hope blind him to danger. The town had opinions, of course. It always did. The next Sunday, as Elijah carried the girls into church, he heard the whispers ripple through the pews. "Man like that can't hold a woman. What chance them girls got? Bet they end up knocked up by 16, just like the rest." The venom dripped sweeter than honey off their tongues. Elijah kept his head high. He wasn't here for them. He wasn't here for their pity or their judgment. He was here because the girls needed a foundation, a rhythm of hope stronger than the world's noise. Outside the general store, the white townsfolk weren't much kinder. Old Mr. Harper leaned against a gas pump, whittling a stick down to nothing, spitting tobacco at Elijah's boots. "Should have known better than to think a black man could raise kids alone," he chuckled to his buddies. "Ain't no woman stupid enough to stick around for that." Laughter crackled through the dusty afternoon air. Elijah didn't respond, didn't flinch. He bought the girls their penny candies, tucked their tiny hands into his calloused one, and walked them home under the sweltering sun. Each cruel word carved deeper into him, but he used the pain the only way he knew how. He built with it. Night after night, while the girls slept, he carved tiny birds out of scrap wood, each one more perfect than the last. Freedom birds, he called them quietly. When he finished one, he placed it on the windowsill facing east so they could catch the morning light. "One day," he whispered, "you'll fly so far, these people will have to tilt their heads back just to see you." He didn't have much. No big house, no fat bank account, no steady future. But he had hands that could build anything. And he had a love that wouldn't break, no matter how hard the world pushed against it. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, carrying the scent of sawdust and rain, he swore he could still hear Christine's voice, laughing, defiant, alive, telling him he was enough, telling him to keep building, no matter how many times they tried to tear him down. The time Lillian and Amara turned 10, Elijah Moore's body was worn thin from a decade of battle. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled when carving. His back ached after even a few hours bent over a workbench. Still, he worked. Because working was the only way to outrun the fear gnawing at his soul. The fear that he wouldn't be enough. That the world would steal his daughters the way it had stolen his wife. The carpentry shop, tucked behind a row of sagging oaks, had once been the pride of the black side of town. Elijah built it himself after returning from the service, a place where worn hands could still make beautiful things. But times had changed. White-owned factories undercut prices, flooding the market with machine-made furniture. Timber costs skyrocketed after new taxes rolled in, hitting black tradesmen the hardest. And still, Elijah stayed. He crafted desks, tables, bed frames, anything anyone needed. Because this shop wasn't just wood and nails. It was memory. It was dignity. It was the promise he made to Christine, standing over her fresh grave with 2 newborns in his arms. Then came the notice. 2 white men in stiff suits posted it right on the shop's front door. Facility non-compliant. Cease operations or face penalty. Elijah stared at the paper, his vision blurring around the edges. New regulations, new safety standards, new fees, all designed, conveniently, to bleed out the small black businesses. He pleaded for time, offered to make changes, promised to fix anything they asked. But their smiles never touched their eyes. They didn't want repairs. They wanted erasure. By the time he finished reading the fine print, Elijah knew fixing the shop would cost more than he made in a year. He sat alone that night in the dark, the twins sleeping across the room, whispering dreams into the thin air. The shop key hung heavy around his neck. He twisted it in his fingers until the metal left angry grooves in his skin. Selling the shop would be like cutting off his own hand. But what good was a hand if it couldn't feed his daughters? The next morning, Elijah took a slow walk through the shop, running his palms over the battered work tables, the gouged floors, the walls covered in pencil marks where he had measured wood, and sometimes the girls' heights. He paused at one corner where Lillian had scrawled crooked letters, learning to write her name with a carpenter's pencil. He kissed his fingertips and pressed them to the wall. Then he took down the Moore Carpentry sign and carried it home like a folded flag. Word traveled fast in Monroe County. By noon, the vultures were sigh-by RCLing. Old Man Thatcher who owned half the downtown strip, made the first offer, insultingly low. "You're lucky anyone's willing to take it off your hands, son," he said, flashing yellow teeth. Elijah bit down the anger swelling in his throat. He wasn't selling for pride. He was selling for possibility. He took the offer. The day the papers were signed, he stood in front of the shop one last time. Lillian on one side, Amara on the other, their small hands gripping his. He didn't cry. Not when they boarded up the windows. Not when they ripped out the shelves he had built with his bare hands. Not even when they slapped a new sign over the old one, replacing his family's name with something cold and foreign. He just walked away. The shop's creaking door swung shut behind him, whispering goodbye in a language only he could hear. The townsfolk had plenty to say, of course. "Fool sold his legacy for a couple of textbooks," they muttered at the diner counters. "Black folks always thinking education's gonna save 'em. Waste of good wood, if you ask me." But Elijah didn't answer them. He moved the girls into a one-room rental behind the black church, close enough for them to walk to school without crossing into dangerous parts of town. Every morning he packed their lunches with whatever he could scrape together. Leftover biscuits, bruised apples, a slice of hope tucked between the bread. He picked up janitorial work, cleaned offices at night, fixed broken pews at the church on weekends. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them in school, enough to keep the dream alive. The girls didn't complain. When the lights flickered and the heater groaned, they pulled blankets tighter and told each other stories until they fell asleep. When dinner was just rice and gravy, they smiled wider, thanking him like it was a feast. On Sunday mornings, Elijah dressed them in starched hand-me-down dresses, their braids neat and tight, and watched them walk up the church steps ahead of him. Straight-backed, proud, unbowed. He didn't need a shop. He didn't need a fancy nameplate or a shiny storefront. He had all the wealth he could ever want, walking 2 steps ahead, wearing second-hand shoes and carrying dreams bigger than any ceiling Monroe County could offer. One night, after a long shift scrubbing the courthouse floors, Elijah sat on the rickety porch, watching the stars blink into life. The girls slept inside, their small snores like music leaking through the thin walls. He rubbed his aching knees and whispered into the dark. "Christine," he said, voice breaking, "I hope you're watching. I hope you see what I'm trying to build here." A breeze stirred the dry grass. Somewhere far off, a train whistle wailed. And for a fleeting moment, Elijah could swear he felt her hand on his shoulder. Warm, steady, proud. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of sawdust and sweat, and let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was doing enough. The city was louder, harsher, and less forgiving than Monroe County. Concrete swallowed the earth, and the air smelled of exhaust and rust instead of fresh sawdust and rain. Elijah Moore clutched the twins' hands tighter as they weaved through traffic, past sneering faces and indifferent crowds. They found a one-room flat above an old laundromat. The floors slanted, the pipes leaked, and cockroaches claimed the kitchen by night. But it was close to the school. That was all that mattered. Elijah picked up a job as a night janitor at Jefferson Public Library, sweeping marble floors long after the world had gone to sleep. The head librarian, Mrs. Green, a stern but fair woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, looked him up and down before handing him a broom. "You respect the books. You respect this place," she said simply. Elijah nodded. He would respect anything that gave his girls a chance. Each morning before sunrise, he shuffled home, his knees throbbing, hands raw from bleach and soap. Some days, the twins woke to find him asleep at the kitchen table, head resting beside their homework assignments. They never woke him. Instead, they pulled a blanket over his shoulders, quietly setting their breakfast, usually stale bread and canned beans, before tiptoeing off to school. Lillian thrived in science. Amara devoured every book she could find, scribbling notes into battered composition journals rescued from the library's discard pile. The white kids at school sneered at their hand-me-down clothes and worn-out shoes, but the twins kept their heads high. Because they knew what sacrifice looked like. Because they woke up every morning to it sitting at the kitchen table, rubbing sleep from his bloodshot eyes and smiling anyway. The city didn't make it easy. Market vendors shortchanged Elijah when they saw his dark hands and worn boots. Landlords raised rent without warning. Even in the library, patrons wrinkled their noses, tossing trash onto the floor for him to pick up. One afternoon, while mopping the grand reading hall, Elijah overheard two businessmen chuckling by the law books section. "Imagine breaking your back for minimum wage just to send some little colored girls to school," one said. Elijah kept his head down, kept mopping, because he wasn't just cleaning floors. He was laying down a path, one sticky tile at a time, so his daughters could walk somewhere the world told them they didn't belong. When money got tighter, Elijah found extra work cleaning office buildings on weekends. The twins joined him sometimes, after finishing homework under dim library lamps. They wiped desks, emptied trash cans, and polished brass doorknobs until their small arms ached. Not because he asked, because they wanted to, because they understood. They saved every penny they earned into a rusty coffee tin marked Sky Fund, a name Amara scribbled across the lid in faded red marker. The dream stayed alive in that tin, even when the world tried to crush it under rising prices and cold stares. One rainy afternoon, the girls' school announced a field trip to the city's regional airport. The fee was laughable for most families, the cost of 2 hamburgers. For Elijah, it was a week's worth of groceries. He didn't say no. He just worked 3 extra shifts, scrubbing graffiti off subway walls at midnight, dragging his mop along miles of cracked tile. When the day of the trip came, Lillian and Amara boarded the yellow school bus with brown paper sack lunches and shining eyes. Elijah stood on the cracked sidewalk long after the bus pulled away, soaking wet, watching the taillights disappear into the mist. He didn't know what they saw that day, didn't know how their hearts had lifted when planes roared overhead, slicing through the clouds like promises made real, didn't know that inside their small chests, new dreams were being stitched together. Dreams so big, so bright, they made the poverty of home almost invisible. When they returned, faces flushed with excitement, Amara launched into explanations about engines and lift forces, while Lillian clutched a wrinkled brochure from the Aviation Academy, her fingers trembling. "We can fly, Papa," she said breathlessly. "We can really fly." Elijah smiled, even as fear gnawed at him. Flying cost more than dreams. It cost money they didn't have, connections they didn't know, privilege the world had long denied them. But he nodded anyway, pulled them close, and whispered, "Then we'll build you wings ourselves." Nights blurred into months. Elijah learned to patch their shoes with leftover leather scraps from a shoemaker down the street. He mended uniforms until seams split and threatened to unravel again. He skipped meals so the girls could have an extra carton of milk or a few more pencils for math class. He took no vacations, no sick days. He cleaned, scrubbed, and polished until his knees screamed and his back seized, until calluses split and bled through worn gloves. When loneliness and exhaustion whispered poison in his ear, telling him it would never be enough, Elijah simply looked at the girls, heads bent over homework, faces lit by hope, and pushed through one more night. Because giving up was a luxury he couldn't afford. Because breaking was not an option. Because his daughters deserved a sky without ceilings. And he would scrub every floor, wipe every window, and polish every stair until they got there, no matter how long it took, no matter how heavy the world became. Elijah Moore had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. The years had etched deep lines across Elijah Moore's face. His hands, once steady, now trembled slightly as he pushed a mop across the library floors. His hair, once rich and dark, was now a crown of silver. But his spirit, the part of him that mattered, remained unbroken. Every evening after his shift, he sat on the library steps with a battered thermos of coffee, watching the world hurry past him. Sometimes he wondered if the world even noticed him anymore. 25 years had slipped by like smoke through his fingers. His daughters had moved away after graduation, letters becoming phone calls becoming voicemails, voicemails becoming rare holiday visits. He never complained. He knew they were chasing something bigger, something he could barely even imagine. Still, on some nights, he found himself standing at the cracked window of his tiny apartment, watching the planes blink across the night sky, wondering if one of them carried Lillian or Amara. He prayed they hadn't forgotten where they came from. He prayed he hadn't been just a stepping stone they left behind. On a crisp Saturday morning, Elijah finished wiping down the library's marble floors. Mrs. Green waved him off early, her smile unusually bright. "Go home, Mr. Moore," she said, patting his shoulder. "Today's not a day for working." Confused but grateful, he slung his jacket over his shoulder and stepped out into the golden sunlight. As he shuffled down the sidewalk, he noticed a sleek black SUV idling outside the old church, where he used to sweep floors for extra money. Two figures stood by the church steps, their backs to him, dressed sharp in tailored suits that gleamed in the sun. For a moment, he thought maybe there was a wedding, or a funeral. Then one of the figures turned. His heart stopped. Lillian's smile, broad, breathtaking, so much like her mother's, lit up the whole street. Beside her, Amara waved both hands frantically, tears already streaming down her face. "Papa!" she cried out, breaking into a run. Elijah dropped his jacket, dropped everything. He stumbled forward, arms outstretched, and they collided with a force that knocked the breath from all three of them. He felt their grown-up bodies trembling against his chest, their tears soaking through his shirt. He smelled the lavender shampoo he used to rub into their scalps when they were little girls. He heard them both whisper over and over, "Papa, we missed you. Papa, we never forgot." It wasn't until they pulled back, grinning through their tears, that Elijah noticed the others. Behind them, stepping out of the SUV, came men in expensive suits, women in designer heels, black, proud, polished. A banner stretched across the church entrance. Elijah Moore Scholarship Foundation Dedication Ceremony. Elijah's knees buckled slightly. Amara caught his arm, steadying him. "We started it in your name, Papa," Lillian said, her voice thick with emotion. "Scholarships for black students who dare to dream beyond their circumstances." Amara held up a manila folder, shaking with excitement. "And that's not all," she said, flipping it open. Inside were property papers, title deeds, one set for a new house, a real house with a yard and a porch swing, bought and paid for in Elijah's name. Another set for the deed to the land where his old carpentry shop once stood. They had bought it back. They had rebuilt it. They had painted over the cold, sterile signage and restored the original weathered wood with pride. Moore and Daughter's woodworks, carved by hand across the arching doorway. "You built everything for us," Amara said, voice breaking. "Now we're building it back for you." Elijah tried to speak, but no words came. He reached out, touched the deeds, the soft velvet banner, the pride in his daughter's shining eyes. He clutched them to his chest, falling to his knees, overcome. The crowd that had gathered, city officials, church members, former librarians, even the skeptical townsfolk who once mocked him, erupted into applause. For once, Elijah didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He felt honored. Lillian helped him to his feet. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice trembling. She guided him toward the SUV. Inside, parked at the community field, was a gleaming training jet, white and gold, its nose painted with the initials LM, Lillian Moore, First Officer. Amara grinned wide, pulling a small box from her jacket pocket. Inside was a miniature plane, hand-carved from the same mahogany wood Elijah had once taught her to sand and shape. "For your new desk, Papa," she said, "at your new house." Elijah cradled the tiny plane in his scarred hands, tears spilling freely down his face. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every floor scrubbed, and every insult endured had led to this moment. He looked up at his daughters, fierce, brilliant, unbreakable. He whispered almost too softly to hear, "I would do it all again, every single step." They pulled him into another hug, their arms weaving together the past, the present, and a future so bright it almost hurt to look at. Above them, the clouds parted, and sunlight flooded the field, turning the grass into a sea of gold. Elijah tilted his face to the sky, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. His daughters had flown higher than he ever dared dream. And somehow, against every odd, against every wall the world had built to stop them, they had carried him right along with them. Home. The new house smelled of fresh paint, lemon polish, and something deeper, hope stitched into every beam and floorboard. Elijah Moore sat on the wide porch, a mug of sweet tea in his hands, watching the sunset melt into the horizon. Children's laughter drifted from the backyard, where his grandkids chased fireflies across the newly mowed grass. Inside, the mantel above the fireplace bore framed photographs of a life hard-fought and well-lived. Lillian, in her crisp pilot's uniform, grinning wide beneath the towering engines of a passenger jet. Amara standing proudly before a courtroom, briefcase in one hand, diploma in the other. And in the center, between them, an old picture of Elijah and Christine. Young, hopeful, invincible. He touched the frame lightly, his thumb brushing over Christine's smile. "You see them, baby?" he whispered. "You see what we built?" The front door creaked open behind him. Amara stepped out, barefoot, holding a manila envelope. "Daddy," she said, smiling, "we have something else for you." She handed him the envelope, her fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary. Inside was a letter, typed neatly, but signed with a flourish he recognized immediately. The board of the Christine Moore Memorial Foundation was expanding, a new wing dedicated to aviation training for underprivileged youth, scholarships named after Elijah Moore himself, and at the bottom, in big proud letters, Founder Elijah Moore, Craftsman of Dreams. Tears blurred the words until they shimmered like the stars beginning to peek out overhead. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the pocket over his heart. He didn't need riches. He didn't need plaques or grand speeches. This was enough. Lillian appeared beside him, a bowl of peach cobbler in one hand, her hair loose around her shoulders. She plopped down into the rocking chair next to his, kicking off her heels with a sigh. "Long flight today," she said, digging into the cobbler. "But every time we land, I whisper a prayer for you." He chuckled softly. "You keep praying," he said. "But you keep flying higher, too." The porch light flickered on, casting a warm halo over them. A soft breeze carried the scent of magnolias and fresh earth. From somewhere inside the house, a radio played an old Sam Cooke song, smooth, hopeful, carrying all the weight and sweetness of generations who refused to bow. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, letting it wash over him. This peace wasn't an accident. It was carved from every sleepless night, every calloused hand, every sacrifice no one saw but him and God. It was earned. It was sacred. The grandkids clambered onto the porch, jostling for space on his lap. He chuckled, pulling them close, breathing in their innocence like it was oxygen. One of them, a little girl with wild curls and Lillian's defiant chin, held up a crayon drawing. It showed a plane soaring high above a tiny house with a big tree out front. Stick figures waved from the porch. At the bottom, in bold, wobbly letters, she had written, "Grandpa's house, where dreams take off." He swallowed hard, pulling her tighter against his chest. For a long time, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. The crickets sang their chorus. The rocking chairs creaked in gentle rhythm. And Elijah Moore, a simple black carpenter who had once fought the world with nothing but splintered hands and a stubborn heart, smiled wider than he had in years. He had given everything, and everything had come back to him, tenfold, shining brighter than he ever dared dream. As the sky darkened, Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "every time I fly over a town, I wonder how many fathers are still sweeping floors, still believing in their kids, even when no one else does." He nodded, his throat too tight to answer. Because he knew. He had been that father. Still was. Would always be. A promise, once whispered in a hospital hallway soaked in sorrow, had become a legacy stretching across runways and courtrooms and classrooms. He looked up at the night sky, at the bright scatter of stars, and found himself smiling. Once they had been distant and unreachable. Now they felt close enough to touch. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a lifetime ease from his shoulders. Somewhere, high above, a plane's red blinking lights traced a steady arc across the heavens. Maybe Lillian was at the controls. Maybe it was someone else's child. Someone whose father once knelt by a broken crib and whispered promises into the dark. It didn't matter, because Elijah Moore knew the truth now. A promise made in love never dies. It soars. It carries generations higher. And if you believe hard enough, if you love fierce enough, it leaves a mark Even the stars can't outshine.